Chapter 18 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Loose Strands. By business time next morning, Brent had cast aside all thought of the previous day's proceedings and of his defeat at the hands of the old gang, and had turned to affairs which were now of far more importance. He had 3 separate enterprises in hand. To be sure, they were all related, but each had a distinctive character of its own. He specified all 3 as he ate his breakfast at the Chancellor, where he was still located. First, now that he had done with his electioneering, for the time being, he was going to work harder than ever at the task of discovering Wallingford's murderer. Secondly, he was going to marry Queenie, and that speedily. Queenie and he had settled matters to their mutual satisfaction as soon as the row with Uncle Simon Crood was over, and they had already begun furnishing the house which Brent had bought in order to constitute himself a full-fledged burgess of Hathelsborough. Thirdly, he was going to put all he knew into the articles which he was writing for the Monitor. 2 had already appeared. He was going on writing them until public opinion, gradually educated, became too strong for the reactionary forces that had beaten him yesterday, but which he would infallibly defeat tomorrow, or, if not tomorrow, the day after. And first, the murderer. He fetched Queenie from Mrs. Appleyard's that morning, and, utterly careless of the sly looks that were cast on him and her, marched her through the market-place to Hawthwaite's office at the police station. To Hawthwaite, keenly interested, he detailed particulars of Queenie's discovery about the typewritten letter and produced her proofs. Hawthwaite took it all in silently. "You'll have to go into that, you know," concluded Brent. "Now that I've got through with that election, I'm going to give more time to this business. We've got to find out who killed my cousin, Hawthwaite, somehow. It's not going to rest. I won't leave a stone unturned. And there," he added, pointing to the sheet of paper on which Queenie had made specimens of the broken type of Simon's antiquated machine, "is a stone which needs examining on all 4 sides." Hawthwaite picked up the sheet of paper, twisted it in his big fingers, and looked over it at the 2 young people with a quizzical smile. "I understand that you and Miss Queenie there are contemplating matrimony, Mr. Brent?" he remarked. "That so, sir?" "That's so," replied Brent promptly. "As soon as we've got our house furnished, we'll be married." "Then I can speak freely and in confidence before Mrs. Brent that's to be," responded Hawthwaite with another smile. "Well, now, what you've just told me isn't exactly fresh news to me. I'll show you something." He turned, drew out a drawer from a chest behind his chair, and finding a paper in it, took it out and handed it to his visitors. "Look at that, now," he said. "You see what it is?" Brent saw at once. It was a half sheet of notepaper on which were examples of faulty type precisely similar to those on Queenie's bit of evidence. "Hullo!" exclaimed Brent. "Somebody else been at the same game, eh?" "I'll tell you," answered Hawthwaite, settling himself in his chair. "It's a bit since let us think now yes, it would be a day or 2 after that facsimile appeared in the Monitor, that a young man came to me here one evening respectable, artisan sort of chap. He told me that he was in the employ of a typewriter company at Clothford, which, Mr. Brent, as Miss Queenie there knows, is our big town, only a few miles away. He said that he'd come to tell me something in confidence. The previous day, he said, Mr. Crood, of Hathelsborough, had come to their place in Clothford, and had brought with him an old-fashioned typewriter, which, he told them, he had bought when such things first came out. He wanted to know the thing, being, he said, an old favourite. If they couldn't do it up for him, go through its mechanism thoroughly, supply new letters, and so on. They said that they could. He left it to be done, and it was handed over to this young man. Now then, this young man, my informant, has some relations here in Hathelsborough. A day or so before Simon Crood called with his machine, they sent him, the young man, a copy of the Monitor with this facsimile letter enclosed. Being concerned with such things in his trade, he was naturally interested in the facsimile, and of course, as an expert, he noticed the broken letters. However, he didn't connect the facsimile with Crood's machine at first, but happening to look at that machine more narrowly, to see exactly what had to be done to it, he, as he phrased it, ran off the keys on a sheet of paper, and he then saw at once that he had before him the identical machine on which the threatening letter to our late Mayor had been typed, and so he came to me. "What have you done about it?" asked Brent. Hawthwaite gave him a knowing look. "Well, I'll tell you that too," he answered. "I've got the machine. It's there, in that box in the corner. The Clothford firm will make an excuse to Mr. Crood that they've had to send this machine away for repairs, eh? Of course, I'm not going to let it out of my possession until until we know more." "There's no doubt he wrote that threatening letter," observed Brent. "Oh, no doubt whatever," agreed Hawthwaite. "What about that handkerchief and the inquiry at the laundry?" asked Brent. Hawthwaite accompanied his reply with a nod and a wink. "That's being followed up," he said. "Don't ask me any more now. We're progressing, and I believe in the right direction this time. Do you leave it to us, Mr. Brent. You'll be surprised before long, and so will some other folks. You go on with those articles you've started in the Monitor. It doesn't do for me to say much, being an official," he added, with another wink. "But you'll do some good in that way. There's a lot under the surface in this old town, sir, that only needs exposing to the light of day to ensure destruction. Public opinion, Mr. Brent, public opinion. You stir it up and leave this matter to me. I may be slow, Mr. Brent, but I'll surely get there in the end." "Good. It's all I ask," said Brent. "Only get there." He took Queenie away, but before they had gone many steps from the superintendent's office, Hawthwaite called Brent back, and leading him inside the room, closed the door on him. "Your young lady'll not mind waiting a minute or two," he said, with a significant glance. "As she already knew about old Simon's typewriter, I didn't mind telling that I knew, d'ye see? But there's another little matter that I'd like to tell you about, between ourselves and to go no further. You understand?" "Just so," agreed Brent. "Well," continued Hawthwaite, "there may be nothing in it, but I've always had a suspicion that there was nothing definite got out of either Dr. Wellesley or Mrs. Saumarez about their I won't say love affairs, but relations. Anyway, that there was something mysterious about the sort of three-cornered relations between her and Wellesley and your cousin, I'm as dead certain as that I see you. I've an idea that somehow or other those relations have something to do with your cousin's murder. But now, this is it, you know, I dare say, that at the back of Mrs. Saumarez's garden at the Abbey House there's a quiet, narrow lane, little used?" "I know it," replied Brent. "Farthing Lane." "Just so. And why so called, none of our local antiquaries know," said Hawthwaite. "Well, not so many nights ago I had some business in that lane at a late hour. I was watching for somebody, as a matter of fact, though it came to nothing. I was in a secret place, just as it was getting nicely dark. Now then, who should come along that lane but Krevin Crood?" "Krevin Crood!" exclaimed Brent. "Aye?" "Krevin Crood," repeated Hawthwaite. "And, thinks I to myself, what may you be doing here, my lad, at this hour of the night? For, as you know that lane, Mr. Brent, you'll know that on one side of it there's nothing but the long wall of Mrs. Saumarez's garden and grounds, and on the other a belt of trees that shuts off Robinson's market garden and orchards. I was safe hidden amongst those trees. Well, Krevin came along. I recognized him well enough. He sort of loitered about, evidently waiting for somebody. And just as the parish church clock struck 10, I heard the click of a latch, and the door in Mrs. Saumarez's back garden opened, and a woman came out. I knew her, too." "Not Mrs. Saumarez?" suggested Brent. "No," replied Hawthwaite, "not Mrs. Saumarez. But that companion of hers, Mrs. Elstrick. Tall, thin, very reserved woman. You may have noticed that she goes about the town very quietly, never talks to anybody." "I've scarcely noticed her, except when she was here in court with Mrs. Saumarez," replied Brent. "But I know the woman you mean. So it was she?" "Just so Mrs. Elstrick," said Hawthwaite. and I saw, of course, that this was a put-up job, an arranged meeting between her and Krevin. They met, turned, walked up and down the lane together for a good 10 minutes, talking in whispers. They passed and repassed me several times, and I'd have given a good deal to hear what they were talking about. But I couldn't catch a word. They were on the opposite side of the lane, you see, close to the garden wall." "And eventually?" asked Brent. "Oh, eventually they parted, of course," replied Hawthwaite. "She slipped back into the garden, and he went off down the lane. Now " "They're both tending to elderliness, I think," interrupted Brent, with a cynical laugh. "But one's never surprised at anything nowadays. So, did you see any love making?" "Oh, Lord save us, no!" exclaimed Hawthwaite. "Nothing of that sort. They never even shook hands. Just talked, and very earnestly, too." Brent reflected for a while. "Queer," he said at last. "What did they want with each other?" "Aye," said Hawthwaite. "As I said just now, I'd have given a good deal to know. But Krevin Crood is a deep, designing, secret sort of man, and that woman, whoever she may be, looks just the same." "Has she been with Mrs. Saumarez long?" asked Brent. "Came with her when Mrs. Saumarez first came and took the Abbey House," replied Hawthwaite. "Always been with her. Went away with her when Mrs. S. was in the south of France all last winter. Odd couple, I call the two of 'em, Mr. Brent, between you and myself." "Why, exactly?" inquired Brent. "I've seen nothing particularly odd about Mrs. Saumarez, except that she's evidently a highly strung, perhaps a bit excitable sort of woman, all nerves, I should say, and possibly a bit emotional. Clever woman, I think, and pretty." "Pretty enough and clever enough," assented Hawthwaite dryly. "And I dare say you're right about the rest. But I'll tell you why I used that term, at least in regard to her. When Mrs. Saumarez first came here, it was understood that she was the widow of a naval officer of high rank. Well, naturally, the big folk of the neighbourhood called on her when she'd settled down. She furnished and fitted her house from local shops, and it took her some time to get fixed up, expecting, of course, that she'd return their calls. She never returned a single one. Not one, sir." "That certainly sounds odd," admitted Brent. "Aye, doesn't it?" said Hawthwaite. "You'd have thought that a young and stylish woman, coming to live here as she did, would have been glad of society. But though some dozen or so ladies of the place called on her, she never, as I say, returned a single call. In fact, it very soon became evident that she didn't want any society of that sort. She used to go out bicycling a good deal by herself in those early days. That, I fancy, was how she got to know both Wellesley and your cousin. She was fond enough of their society, anyway." "Always?" asked Brent. He was learning things that he had never heard of, and was already thinking deeply about them. "From the beginning?" "Well, practically," replied Hawthwaite. "First it was the doctor, then it was Wallingford. And," he added with a wink, "there were folk in the town who declared that she carried on with both, playing one off against the other till the very end. I don't know how that may be, but I do know that at one time she and Wellesley were very thick, and that afterwards your cousin was always running after her. Naturally there was talk, especially amongst the folk who called on her and whose calls she didn't return. And, to tell you the plain truth, they said things." "What sort of things?" inquired Brent. "Oh, well," said Hawthwaite with a laugh, "if you'd lived as long in this town as I have and been in my position, you'd know that it, like all little places, is a hotbed of scandal and gossip. The women, of course, seeing her partiality for men friends, said things and hinted more. Then the vicar's wife parsons' ladies are great ones for talk found something out and made the most of it. I told you that when Mrs. Saumarez first came here, it was understood that she was the widow of an officer of some high position in the Royal Navy. Well, our vicar's wife has a brother who's a big man in that profession, and she was a bit curious to know about the newcomer's relation to it. She persisted in calling on Mrs. Saumarez, though her calls weren't returned. She could make excuses, you see, about parish matters and charities and what not. And one day she asked Mrs. Saumarez point blank what ship her late husband had served on. Now she says that Mrs. Saumarez snapped her up short anyway. Mrs. S. gave her an answer. My late husband, said Mrs. S., was not in the British service. And of course that wasn't in her favour with the people whom she'd already snubbed. Said Brent. There were many things in this retailing of gossip that he wanted to think about at leisure. Well, he added after a pause, I dare say all sorts of small items help towards a solution, Hawthwaite, but you're already busy about it. I'm not only busy, but actively so, replied the superintendent. And between you and me and nobody else, I'm expecting some very special professional and expert assistance within the next few days. Oh, you leave this to me, Mr. Brent. I'll run down your cousin's murderer, or murderess yet. Go you on with your articles. They're helpful, for they're rousing public interest. Brent went away and followed Hawthwaite's advice. His articles came out in the Monitor twice a week. Peppermore printed them in big type, leaded, and gave them the most prominent place in the paper. He himself was as proud of these uncompromising attacks on the municipal government of Hathelsborough as if he had written them himself. The proprietor of the Monitor was placidly agreeable about them, for the simple reason that after the first two had appeared the circulation of his journal doubled, and after the next three was at least 4 times what it had ever been before. Everybody in their immediate neighbourhood read and discussed the articles. Extracts from them were given in the county papers. Some of the London dailies began to lift them. Eventually, a local member of Parliament asked a question about them in the House of Commons, and one day Peppermore came rushing to Brent in a state of high excitement. "The pen is mightier than the sword, Mr. Brent, sir, that's a fact," he gasped, tumbling headlong into Brent's room. "Heard the news, sir, all through your articles." "Heard nothing," replied Brent. "What is it?" "I had it from the Town Clerk just now, so it's gospel truth," replied Peppermore. "The Local Government Board, sir, is, at last, moved to action. It's going to send down an inspector, a real, full-fledged inspector. The Town Clerk is in a worse state of righteous indignation than I ever saw a man, and as for Mayor Simon Crood, I understand his anger is beyond belief. Mr. Brent, you've done it." But Brent was not so sure. He had some experience of government officials and of official methods, and knew more of red tape than Peppermore did. As for Tansley, who came in soon after, he was cynically scornful. "Local Government Board Inspector!" he exclaimed scoffingly. "Pooh! Some old fossil who'll come here. I'll tell you how. He'll ask for the responsible authorities, that's Simon Crood and Company. He'll hear all they've got to say. They'll say what they like. He'll examine their documents. The documents will be all ready for him. Everything will be nice and proper and in strict order, and every man will say precisely what he's been ordered to say, and there you are. The inspector will issue his report that he's carefully examined everything and found all correct, and the comedy will conclude with the farce of votes of thanks all round. That's the line, Brent." "Maybe," said Brent, "and only maybe." "You're in a pessimistic vein, Mr. Tansley, sir," declared Peppermore. "Sir, we're going to clean out the Augean stable." "Or perish in the attempt, eh, Peppermore?" retorted Tansley good-humouredly. "All right, my lad, but it'll take a lot more than Monitor articles and Local Government Board inquiries to uproot the ancient and time-honoured customs of Hathelsborough. Semper eadem, Peppermore, semper eadem. That's the motto of this high-principled, respectably ruled borough. Always the same, and no change." "Except from bad to worse," said Peppermore. "All right, sir, but something's going to happen this time." Something did happen immediately following on the official announcement of the Local Government Board inquiry, and it was Tansley who told Brent of it. "I say," he said, coming up to Brent in the street, "here's a queer business. I don't know if you've heard of it. Mrs. Mallett's run away from her husband. Fact! She cleared clean out, and let it be known, too. Odd! Mystery seemed to be increasing, Brent. What do you make of it?" Brent could make nothing of it. There might be many reasons why Mrs. Mallett should leave her husband. but had this sudden retreat anything to do with Mrs. Mallett's evidence at the inquest? He was speculating on this when he got a request from Hawthwaite to go round at once to his office. He responded immediately to find the superintendent closeted with Dr. Wellesley. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Black secrets and red tape. Before ever Brent dropped into the chair to which Hawthwaite silently pointed him, he knew that he was about to hear revelations. He was conscious of an atmosphere in that drab, sombre little room. Hawthwaite's glance at him as he entered was that of a man who bids another to prepare himself for news. Wellesley looked unusually stern and perplexed. "Dr. Wellesley got me to send for you, Mr. Brent," said the superintendent. "He's got something to tell which he thinks you, as next of kin to our late Mayor, ought to know." Brent nodded and turned in silence to Wellesley. Wellesley, who had been staring moodily at the fireless grate, looked up, glancing from one man to the other. "You understand, Mr. Brent, and you, Hawthwaite, that whatever I tell you is told in the very strictest confidence?" he said. "As you say, Hawthwaite, I think it's something that you ought to know, both of you, but at present I don't know if there's anything in it. I mean anything that has real, practical relation to Wallingford's death, or not. I am to speak in confidence?" "To me, yes," answered Brent promptly. "It'll not go beyond me, Doctor," said Hawthwaite with a smile. "I'm used to this job. Heard more secrets and private communications in my time than I can remember. I've clean forgotten most of them." "Very well," agreed Wellesley. "This is strictly private, then, at present. Now, to begin with, I suppose you have both heard it's pretty well known through the town, I understand that Mrs. Mallett has left her husband?" "Aye," replied Hawthwaite. "I've heard that." "Yes," said Brent. "I, too." "I dare say you both gathered from the evidence of mine and of Mrs. Mallett's at the adjourned inquest that there was some mystery underlying her visit to me?" continued Wellesley. "Some secret, eh?" "Couldn't very well gather anything else, Doctor," replied Hawthwaite. "Evident!" "The fact of the case is," said Wellesley suddenly, "that wasn't the first visit Mrs. Mallett had paid to me, and to Wallingford, in that way. She'd been twice before during that week. On the first occasion she only saw me; on the second she and I saw Wallingford together in the Mayor's Parlour. On the third, the one we gave evidence about, she went to see Wallingford alone, but, as she told you, she found he was engaged and came away." The three men looked at each other. Hawthwaite voiced what two of the three were wondering. "Some business which concerned all three of you, then, Doctor?" he suggested. "Business which deeply concerned her, and on which she came to consult me and Wallingford," replied Wellesley. "Now, I'll tell you straight out what it was. Mrs. Mallett had found out that there was some sort of an intrigue between her husband and Mrs. Saumarez." For a moment a deep silence fell over the room. Brent felt his brows drawing together in a frown, the sort of frown that spreads over a man's face when he tries to think quickly and clearly over a problem unexpectedly presented to him. Hawthwaite folded his arms across his braided tunic, stared at the ceiling, and whistled softly. He was the first to speak. "Uh-oh!" he said. So that's... But she'd have some proof, Doctor, for an assertion of that sort? Not mere guesswork?" "I'm afraid there's no guesswork about it," said Wellesley. "It's not a pleasant matter to discuss, but that's unavoidable now. This is what Mrs. Mallett told Wallingford and myself. Mrs. Mallett, as you know, is a downright, plain-spoken woman, with strong views of her own, and she's just the sort to go through with the thing. Some little time ago she found, evidently through Mallett's carelessness, a receipt for a very valuable diamond ring from a London jeweller, a lady's ring. This, of course, aroused her suspicions, and without saying anything to her husband, she determined to have his movements watched. She knew that Mallett was frequently going away for a day at a time, ostensibly on business connected with the bank, and she employed a private inquiry agent to watch him. This man followed Mallett from Hathelsborough to Clothford one morning, and from Clothford station to the Royal County Hotel, where, in the lounge, he was joined by Mrs. Saumarez, who had been previously pointed out to the agent here in Hathelsborough, and who had evidently cycled over to Clothford. She and Mallett lunched at the Royal County in a private room, and spent the greater part of the afternoon there. The same thing occurred on 2 other occasions. So then Mrs. Mallett came to me and to Wallingford." "Why to you?" demanded Brent. "I think," replied Wellesley, with a forced smile, "she may have had a womanish feeling of revenge, knowing that Wallingford and myself had, well, both paid a good deal of attention to Mrs. Saumarez. But there were other reasons. Mrs. Mallett has few friends in the town. I was her medical attendant, and she and Wallingford frequently met each other on 1 or 2 committees. Mrs. Mallett took a good deal of interest in social affairs. Anyway, she came and confided in us about this." "I suppose you and Wallingford discussed it?" suggested Brent. "Yes," replied Wellesley. "Briefly, on the night before his death." "Was that the reason of your saying at the inquest that there was no jealousy between you at the time of his death, as regards Mrs. Saumarez?" "Just so. There couldn't be any jealousy, could there, after what we'd heard?" "You believed this, then?" "We couldn't do anything else. The man whom Mrs. Mallett employed is a thoroughly dependable man. There's not the slightest doubt that Mrs. Saumarez secretly met Mallett and spent most of the afternoon with him, under the circumstances I mentioned, on 3 separate occasions." "And that's the reason of Mrs. Mallett's sudden flight, if you call it so, is it, doctor?" asked Hawthwaite, who had been listening intently. "That's the reason, yes," replied Wellesley. "What's she going to do?" inquired Hawthwaite. "Divorce?" "She said something about a legal separation," answered Wellesley. "I suppose it will come to the other thing." "And how do you think this is related to Wallingford's murder?" asked Hawthwaite with sudden directness. "Let's be plain, doctor. Do you suspect Mallett?" Wellesley showed signs of indecision. "I don't like to say that I do," he replied at last. "And yet I don't know. I've rather wondered if there'd been any meeting between Mallett and Wallingford after Wallingford knew about this. I believe they did meet, on business, during the day. Now, to tell you the truth, Wallingford was much more shall we say upset? About this affair than I was. He was very much gone on Mrs. Saumarez. It struck me that he may have threatened Mallett with exposure. And exposure, of course, would mean a great deal to a man in Mallett's position a bank manager and town trustee, and so on. But I really don't know what to think." "There's a thing I'd like to know," said Brent. "What do you think about the woman in the case? You've had chances of knowing her." Wellesley gave his questioner a searching look. "I would rather not say, Mr. Brent," he replied. "Discoveries of this sort, substantiated, are disconcerting. Besides, they tend to a revision of opinion. They're sidelights, unfortunate ones." "Look here," said Brent, "were you greatly surprised?" "Well, looking back," responded Wellesley thoughtfully, "perhaps not greatly. I think she's a bit of a mystery." Brent turned to Hawthwaite. Hawthwaite, however, looked at the doctor. "Well, doctor," he said, "I think you've done right to tell this. There's something in the suggestion that there may have been a fatal quarrel between Mallett and Wallingford. But I don't want to go into this at present. I'm full up otherwise. Leave it until this Local Government Board inspection is over." "Why until then?" asked Wellesley. "Why, because for anything we know to the contrary, something may come out at that which will dovetail into this," replied Hawthwaite. "The inspector is coming down at once. We'll leave this over till he's been. Look here, has Mrs. Mallett let this out to anybody but you?" "No, I'm sure of that," answered Wellesley. "It's been known in the town for some time common knowledge that she and Mallett weren't on good terms. But she assured me just before leaving that she hasn't mentioned the episodes I've detailed to any other person here than myself and, of course, Wallingford." "And he's gone, poor fellow," said Hawthwaite. "And Mr. Brent and myself will be secret as to the grave he lies in. All right, doctor. Just leave it to me." When Wellesley had gone away, Hawthwaite turned to Brent. "I don't believe for one moment that Mallett murdered your cousin," he said. "I'm not surprised about this other affair, but I don't think it's anything to do with what we're after. No, that's on a side track. But I'll tell you what, Mr. Brent, I shouldn't be astonished if I found out that Mallett knows who the murderer is." "I wish you'd tell me if you've any idea yourself who the murderer is!" exclaimed Brent. "I'm wearying to get at something concrete." "Well, if you must have it, I have an idea," answered the superintendent. "It's a strong idea, too. I'm working at it. To tell you the truth, though nobody knows it but one or two of my trusted men, I've had a very clever man down from New Scotland Yard for the past fortnight. He went away yesterday, and he was of great assistance in unearthing certain facts. And I'm only waiting now for some expert evidence on a very important point which I can't get until next week in order to make a move. As soon as ever this Local Government Board inspection's over, I'll make that move. And how do you think that inspection will turn out, Mr. Brent?" "Don't know, can't say, no idea," replied Brent. "Nor have I," remarked Hawthwaite. "Candidly, I never expect much help from so-called public inquiries. There's too much officialism about 'em. Still, every little bit helps." These conversations, and the revelations which had transpired during their course, led Brent into a new train of thought. He had been well aware, ever since his coming to Hathelsborough, of an atmosphere of intrigue and mystery; every development that occurred seemed to thicken it. Here again was more intrigue, centring in a domestic imbroglio. There was nothing much to be wondered at in it, he thought. Mallett was the sort of man to attract a certain type of woman, and from all Brent had heard in the town, a man given to adventure. Mrs. Saumarez was clearly a woman fond of men's society. Mrs. Mallett, on the other hand, was a straight-laced, hard sort, given to social work and the furtherance of movements in which her husband took no interest. The sequence of events seemed probable to Brent. First there had been Wellesley, then Wallingford, perhaps a cleverly contrived double affair with both. But during a recent period there had been this affair with Mallett, that from Wellesley's showing had come to Wallingford's ears. Brent knew his cousin sufficiently well to know that Wallingford would develop an ugly frame of mind on finding that he had been deceived. All sorts of things might well develop out of a sudden discovery. But had all this anything to do with Wallingford's murder? That, after all, was to him the main point. And so far he saw no obvious connection. He felt like a man who is presented with a mass of tangled cord, from which protrude a dozen loose ends. Which end to seize upon that, on being drawn out, would not reveal more knots and tangles, he did not know, for the very life of him. Perhaps, as Hawthwaite had remarked, it all helped, but as far as Brent could see, it was still difficult to lay hold of a continuous and unbroken line. It puzzled him, being still a stranger to the habits and customs of these people, to see that life in Hathelsborough went on, amidst all these alarums and excursions, very much as usual. He had already cultivated a habit of frequenting places of public resort, such as the smoking room of his hotel, the big bar room at Bull's, the rooms of the Town Club, to which he had without difficulty been duly elected a member on Tansley's nomination. At all these places he heard a great deal of gossip, but found no surprise shown at its subjects. Within a day or two, everybody who frequented these places knew that there had been a domestic upheaval at Mallett's, and had at least some idea of the true reason for it. But nobody showed any astonishment; everybody, indeed, seemed to take it as a matter of course. Evidently it made no difference to Mallett himself, who was seen about the town just as usual, in his accustomed haunts; and when Brent remarked on this seeming indifference to Epplewhite, whom he sometimes conversed with at the club, Epplewhite only laughed. "If you knew this town and its people as well as I do, Mr. Brent," he said, "you'd know that things of this sort are viewed in a light that outsiders, perhaps, wouldn't view them in. The underhand affairs, the intrigues, the secret goings-on that exist here are multitudinous. Hathelsborough folk have a fixed standard: do what you like as long as you don't get found out. Understand, sir?" "But in this case the thing seems to have been found out," remarked Brent. "That, in the Hathelsborough mental economy, is the only mistake in it," replied Epplewhite dryly. "It's the only thing that Mallett will get blamed for. Lord bless you, do you think he's the only man in the place that's had such an affair? But Hathelsborough folk, men and women, are past masters and mistresses at secrecy and deception. If you could take the top off this town and look deep down under it, there would be something to see! But, as I dare say you're beginning to find out, that's no easy job." "Will the top be lifted at this Local Government Board inspection?" asked Brent. Epplewhite shook his head. "I doubt it, sir," he answered. "I doubt it very much. I've seen a bit too much of officialism, Mr. Brent, to cherish any hopes of it. I'll tell you what'll probably happen when this inspector comes. To start with, he's bound to be more or less in the hands of the officials. We know who they are, the 3 Town Trustees and the staff under them. Do you think they won't prepare their books and documents in such a fashion as to ensure getting a report in their favour? Of course! And what's to stop it? Who's to interfere?" "I suppose he will hear both sides of the question," suggested Brent. "Who is there to put the other side of the question except on broad lines, such as you've taken up in your Monitor articles?" asked Epplewhite. "True, the inspector can ask for information and for criticism, and for any facts bearing on the subject. But who'll come forward to give it? Can I? Can Wellesley? Can any of our party? Not one, in any satisfactory fashion. We've nothing but impressions and suspicions to go on. We haven't access to the books and papers. The only man who could have done something was your cousin, our late Mayor, and he's gone. And talking about that, Mr. Brent, there's a matter that I've been thinking a good deal about lately, and I think it should be put to Hawthwaite. You know, of course, that your cousin and I were very friendly. That came out in my evidence when the inquest was first opened. Well, he used to tell me things about his investigation of these Corporation finances, and I happen to know that he kept his notes and figures about them in a certain memorandum book, a thickish one, with a stout red leather cover, which he always carried about with him. He'd have it on him, or on his desk in the Mayor's Parlour when he met his death, I'm certain. Now then, where is that book?" "That's highly important," said Brent. "I never heard of it. It certainly wasn't on him, and it wasn't on the desk, for I examined that myself in company with the police." "Well, he had such a book, and search should be made for it," remarked Epplewhite. "If it could have been produced at this inquiry, some good might have come of it. But as things are, I see little hope of any change. Vested interests and old customs aren't upset in a day, Mr. Brent." And Brent was soon to discover that both Tansley and Epplewhite were correct in their prophecies about the investigation which he himself had so strenuously advocated in his articles. The Local Government Board inspector came. He sat in the Moot Hall for 2 days, in public. He examined the ancient charters and deeds. He questioned the Town Trustees. He went through the books. He invited criticism and objections, and got nothing but a general statement of the policy of the reforming party from Epplewhite as its leader. That party, said Epplewhite, objected to the old Constitution as being outworn, and wished for a more modern arrangement. Finally, the inspector, referring to the articles in the Monitor which had led to the holding of the inquiry, expressed a wish to see and question their writer. Brent stood up in the midst of a crowded court and confessed himself sole author of the articles in question. "Why did you write them?" inquired the inspector. "From a sense of public duty," replied Brent. "But I understand that you are a stranger, or a comparative stranger, to the town?" suggested the inspector. "I am a burgess, a resident, and a property owner in the town. I took up this work, which I mean to see right through, in succession to my cousin, John Wallingford, late Mayor of this borough, who was murdered in this very hall," said Brent. "There are men here who know that he was working day and night to bring about the financial reforms which I advocate." The inspector moved uneasily in his seat at the sound of the word which Brent emphasized in reference to his cousin. "I am sure I sympathise with you, Mr. Brent," he said. "I have been much grieved to hear of the late Mayor's sad fate. But you say you have voluntarily taken up his work? Did he leave you any facts, figures, statistics, particulars to work on?" "If he had known that I was going to take up his work, he would doubtless have left me plenty," replied Brent. "But he was murdered. He had such things a certain notebook filled with his discoveries." "Where is that book?" inquired the inspector. "Can it be produced?" "It cannot," said Brent. "It was stolen when my cousin was killed." The inspector hesitated, shuffling his papers. "Then you have no figures, facts, anything, Mr. Brent?" he said presently. "Nothing to support your newspaper articles?" "Nothing of that sort," answered Brent. "My articles refer wholly to the general principle of the thing." The inspector smiled. "I'm afraid governments, national or municipal, aren't run on general principles, Mr. Brent," he remarked. "No," said Brent. "They seem to be run on the lack of them." The official inquiry came to an end on that, amidst good-humoured laughter at Brent's apparently ingenuous retort. The inspector announced that he would issue his report in due course, and everybody knew what it would be. The good old ways, the time-honoured customs would have another lease of life. Once more Simon Crood had come out on top. But as he was leaving the Moot Hall, Brent felt his arm touched, and turned to see Hawthwaite. The superintendent gave him a knowing look. "To-morrow," he whispered. "Be prepared. All's done. All's ready." Chapter 20 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fell Hand. Brent heard what the superintendent said, nodded a silent reply, and 5 minutes later had put that particular thing clean out of his mind. During the progress of the Local Government Board inquiry he had learned something: that men like Tansley and Epplewhite knew a lot more about Hathelsborough and Hathelsborough folk than he did, or that Wallingford had known, despite the murdered man's longer experience of town and people. Reform was not going to be carried out in a day in that time-worn borough, nor were its ancient customs, rotten and corrupt as they were, to be uprooted by newspaper articles. So far, Simon Crood and his gang had won all along the line, and Brent realised that most men in his position would have given up the contest and retired from the field in weariness and disgust. But he was not going to give up, nor to retire. He had a feeling, amounting to something near akin to a superstition, that it was his sacred duty to carry on his dead cousin's work, especially as Wallingford, by leaving him all his money, had provided him with the means of doing it. There in Hathelsborough he was, and in Hathelsborough he would stick, holding on like a bulldog to the enemy. "I'm not counted out," he said that evening, talking the proceedings of the day over with Queenie. "I'm up again and ready for the next round. Here I am, and here I stop. But new tactics, permeation, that's the ticket. Reckon I'll nitrate and percolate the waters of pure truth into these people in such a fashion that they'll come to see that what that old uncle of yours and his precious satellites have been giving 'em was nothing but a very muddy mixture. Permeation, that's the game in future." Queenie scarcely knew what he meant, but she gathered a sense of it from the set of his square jaw and the flash of his grey eyes. Being increasingly in love with him, it was incomprehensible to her that anybody could beat Brent at any game he took a hand in. "The inquiry was all cut-and-dried business," remarked Queenie. "Arranged. Of course the accounts and things would be cooked. Uncle Simon and Mallett and Coppinger would see to that. They'll have an extra bottle to-night over this victory. And if they could only hear to-morrow that you're going to clear out, their joy would be full." "Well, I'm not," declared Brent. "Instead of clearing out, I'm going to dig in. I guess they'll find me entrenched harder than ever before long. We'll get on at that to-morrow, now that this all hollow inquiry's over." Queenie understood him perfectly that time. He and she were furnishing the house which Brent had purchased in order to get a properly legal footing in Hathelsborough. It was serious and occasionally deeply fascinating work, necessitating much searching of the shops wherein antique furniture was stored, much consultation with upholsterers and decorators, much consideration of style and effect. Brent quickly discovered that Queenie was a young woman of artistic taste, with a natural knowledge and appreciation of colour schemes and values. Queenie found out that Brent had a positive horror of the merely modern. Consequently, this furnishing and decorating business took up all their spare time. Queenie eventually spent all hers at the house, superintending and arranging. Brent was there when he was not writing his Monitor articles or interviewing Hawthwaite. The unproductive inquiry had broken into this domestic adventure. Brent now proposed to go ahead with it until it was finished, then he and Queenie would quietly get married and settle down. Hathelsborough, he remarked, might not want him, but there in Hathelsborough he had set up his tent, and the pegs were firmly driven in. On the day succeeding the Local Government Board inquiry, Brent and Queenie had spent morning, afternoon, and the first part of the evening at the house, at the head of a small gang of workmen, and had reduced at least half of the chaos to order. As dusk grew near, Brent put on his coat and gave Queenie one of his looks which signified that there was no answer needed to what he was about to say. "That's enough," said Brent. "Dog tired. Now we'll go round to the Chancellor and get the best dinner they can give us. Put on your hat." Queenie obeyed readily enough. She was in that stage whereat a young woman finds obedience the most delightful thing in the world. Brent locked up the house, and they went away together towards the hotel. In the old market square the lamps were just being lighted. As usual, there were groups of townsfolk gathered about High Cross and Low Cross, and the pavements were thronged with strolling pedestrians. Something suggested to Brent that all these folk were discussing some news of moment. He heard excited voices. Once or twice men glanced inquisitively at Queenie and himself as they walked towards the Chancellor. On the steps outside the hotel a knot of men, amongst them the landlord, were plainly in deep debate. They became silent as Queenie and Brent passed in, and Brent, ushering Queenie into the inner hall, turned back to them. "Something going?" he asked laconically. The men looked at each other. The landlord, with a glance in Queenie's direction, replied, lowering his voice. "Then you haven't heard, Mr. Brent," he said. "I thought you'd have known. Hawthwaite's arrested Krevin Crood for the murder." In spite of his usual self-possession, Brent started. "What!" he exclaimed. "Krevin?" "Krevin," answered the landlord. "And Simon, both of 'em. Got 'em at 7 o'clock. They're in the police station. Cells, of course. Nice business, mayor of a town arrested for the murder of his predecessor." "As far as I can make out, Simon's charged with being accessory," remarked one of the other men. "Krevin's the culprit in chief." "Well, there they both are, anyway," said the landlord. "And if I know anything about the law, it's as serious a thing to be accessory to a murder as to be the principal in one. What do you say, Mr. Brent?" Brent made no reply. He was thinking. So this is what Hawthwaite had meant when he said the day before that all was ready. He wished that Hawthwaite had given him a hint, or been perfectly explicit with him, for there was Queenie to consider. And now, without further remark to the group of gossipers, he turned on his heel and went back to her and took her into the coffee room and to the table which was always specially reserved for him. Not until Queenie had eaten her dinner did he tell her of what he had learned. "So now there's going to be hell for a time, girlie," he said in conclusion. "No end of unpleasantness for me, and for you, considering that these men are your folk. And so all the more reason why you and I stick together like leeches. Not all the Simons and the Krevins of the world are going to make any difference between you and me, and we'll just go forward as if they didn't exist, whatever comes out. And now, come along, and I'll see you home to Mother Appleyard's, and then I'll drop in on Hawthwaite and learn all about it." Do you think they did it?" asked Queenie, in a fearful whisper. "Actually?" "God knows," muttered Brent. "Damned if I do, or know what to think. But Hawthwaite must have good grounds for this." He saw Queenie safely home to Mrs. Appleyard's, and hurried off to the police station, where he found the superintendent alone in his office. "You've heard," said Hawthwaite. "I've heard," replied Brent. "I wish you'd given me an idea, a hint." Hawthwaite shook his head. There was something peculiarly emphatic in the gesture. "Mr. Brent," he said solemnly, "I wouldn't have given the King himself a hint. I'd reasons good reasons for keeping the thing a profound secret until I could strike. As it is, I've been foiled. I've got Krevin Crood and I've got Simon Crood safely under lock and key. But I haven't got the other two." "What other two?" exclaimed Brent. Hawthwaite smiled sourly. "What other two?" he repeated. "Why, Mallett and Coppinger. They're off, though how the devil they got wind of what was going on, I can't think. Leaked out somehow." "You suspect them too?" asked Brent. "Suspect!" sneered Hawthwaite. "Lord, you wait till Simon and Krevin are brought up before the magistrates to morrow morning. We've got the whole evidence so absolutely full and clear that we can go right full steam ahead with the case to morrow. Meeking'll prosecute, and I hope to get 'em committed before the afternoon's over." "Look here," said Brent. "Tell me what's the line? How does the thing stand?" "Thus," replied Hawthwaite. "We shall charge Krevin with the murder of your cousin, and Simon with being accessory to the fact." "Before or after?" asked Brent. "Before." "And those other two? Mallett and Coppinger?" "Same charge as Simon." Brent took a turn or two about the room. "That," he remarked, pausing at last in front of Hawthwaite's desk, "means that there was a conspiracy?" "To be sure," assented Hawthwaite. "Got proof of it." "Then I wish you'd laid hands on Mallett and Coppinger," said Brent. "You've no idea of their whereabouts, I suppose?" "None so far," replied Hawthwaite. "Nor can I make out how or precisely when they slipped off. But they are off. Oddly enough, Mrs. Mallett's back in the town. I saw and spoke to her an hour ago. Of course she knows nothing about Mallett. She didn't come back to him. I don't know what she came back for. She's staying with friends, down Waterdale." "What time will these men be brought up to morrow morning?" asked Brent. 10 o'clock sharp," answered Hawthwaite. "And I hope that before the end of the afternoon they'll have been fully committed to take their trial. As I said just now, we can go straight on. Careful preparation makes speedy achievement, Mr. Brent, and by the Lord Harry, we've done some preparing." "If only the whole thing is cleared at last," said Brent quietly. "You think, now, it will be?" Hawthwaite smacked his hand on his blotting pad. "Haven't the shadow of a doubt, Mr. Brent, that Krevin Crood murdered your cousin," he asserted. "But you'll hear for yourself to morrow. Come early. And a word of advice." "Yes?" Brent inquired. "Leave your young lady at home," said Hawthwaite. "No need for her feelings to be upset. They're her uncles, these two, after all, you know. Don't bring her." "No, of course," assented Brent. "Never intended to." He went away to his hotel, sorely puzzled. Hawthwaite seemed positively confident that he had solved the problem at last. But was Hawthwaite right? Somehow Brent could scarcely think of Krevin Crood as a cold-blooded murderer, nor did it seem probable to him that calculating, scheming men like Simon Crood, Mallett and Coppinger would calmly plot assassination and thereby endanger their own safety. One thing anyway seemed certain. If Wallingford's knowledge of the financial iniquities of the Town Trustees was so deep as to lead them to commit murder as the only way of compelling his silence, then those iniquities must have been formidable indeed, and the great and extraordinary wonder was that they had just been able to cloak them so thoroughly and successfully. He was early in attendance at the court room of the Moot Hall next morning, and for a particular reason of his own selected a seat in close proximity to the door. Long before the magistrates had filed onto the bench, the whole place was packed, and Hawthwaite, passing him, whispered that there were hundreds of people in the market square who could not get in. Everybody of any note in Hathelsborough was present. Brent particularly observed the presence of Mrs. Mallett, who, heavily veiled, sat just beneath him. He looked in vain, however, for Mrs. Saumarez. She was not there. but in a corner near one of the exits he saw her companion, Mrs. Elstrick, the woman whom Hawthwaite had seen in secret conversation with Krevin Crood in Farthing Lane. Tansley caught sight of Brent, and leaving the solicitors' table in the well of the court, went over to him. "What are you doing perched out there?" he said. "Come down with me. I'll find room for you." "No," said Brent. "I'm all right here. I may have to leave. And I'm not on in this affair. It's Hawthwaite's show. And is he right, this time?" "God knows!" exclaimed Tansley. "He's something up his sleeve, anyway. Queerest business I ever knew. Simon! If it had been Krevin alone, now! Here, I'll sit by you. I'm not on either. Nobody's instructed me. I say, you'll not notice it, but there's never been such a show of magistrates on that bench for many a year, if ever. Crowded. Every magistrate in the place present. And the chief magistrate to be in the dock presently. That's dramatic effect, if you like." Brent was watching the dock. Prisoners came into it by a staircase at the back. Krevin came first, cool, collected, calmly defiant. Outwardly he was less concerned than any spectator. But Simon shambled heavily forward, his big flabby face coloured with angry resentment and shame. He beckoned to his solicitor and began to talk eagerly to him over the separating partition. He, it was evident, was all nerves and eagerness. But Krevin, after a careful look round the court, during which he exchanged nods with several of his acquaintance, stood staring reflectively at Meeking, as if speculating on what the famous barrister was going to say in opening the case. Meeking said little. The prisoners, he observed, addressing the bench in quiet conversational tones, were charged, Krevin Crood with the actual murder of the late Mayor John Wallingford, Simon with being accessory to the fact, and, if they had not absconded during the previous 24 hours, two other well-known residents of the borough, Stephen Mallett and James Coppinger, would have stood in the dock with Simon Crood, similarly charged. He should show their worships by the evidence which he would produce that patient and exhaustive investigation by the local police had brought to light as wicked a conspiracy as could well be imagined. There could be no doubt in the mind of any reasonable person, after hearing that evidence, that Simon Crood, Mallett and Coppinger entered into a plot to rid themselves of a man who, had his investigations continued, would infallibly have exposed their nefarious practices to the community, nor that they employed Krevin Crood to carry out their designs. He would show that the murder of Wallingford was deliberately plotted at Mallett's house, between the four men, on a certain particular date, and that Krevin Crood committed the actual murder on the following evening. Thanks to the particularly able and careful fashion in which Superintendent Hawthwaite had marshalled the utterly damning body of evidence against these men, their worships would have no difficulty in deciding that there was a prima facie case against them, and that they must be committed to take their trial at the next assizes. Hawthwaite, called first, gave evidence as to the arrest of the two prisoners. He arrested Krevin Crood in the passage leading from Bull's Snug about 6:30 the previous evening, and Simon at his own home half an hour later. Krevin took the matter calmly, and merely remarked that he, Hawthwaite, was making the biggest mistake he had ever made in his life. Simon manifested great anger and indignation, and threatened an action for false imprisonment. When actually charged, neither of the accused made any answer at all. The superintendent stood down, and Meeking looked towards an inner door of the court. An attendant came forward at his nod, bearing a heavy package done up in crown canvas and sealed. At the same moment a smart-looking young man answered to the name of Samuel Owthwaite, and stepped alertly into the witness box. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Corruption. The tightly wedged mass of spectators watched open-mouthed and quivering with anticipation, while the attendant, at Meeking's whispered bidding, broke the seals and cut the strings of the package which he had just carried in. Clearly this was some piece of material evidence, but what? A faint murmur of interest rose as the last wrappings fell aside, and revealed a somewhat the worse for wear typewriter. People glanced from it to the witness. Some of those present recognised him as a young mechanic, a native of Hathelsborough, who had gone, a few years previously, to work in the neighbouring manufacturing city of Clothford. Such began to ask themselves what he could have to do with this case, and waited eagerly for his evidence. But Meeking, the battered typewriter before him, kept the witness waiting. Turning to the bench, he put the depositions taken at the coroner's inquest with respect to the typewritten threatening letter sent to Wallingford and by him entrusted to Epplewhite, the letter itself, and the facsimile of the letter published as a supplement by the Monitor, with a brief explanation of his reasons for bringing them into evidence. Then he addressed himself to his witness, and got the first facts from him. Samuel Outhwaite, mechanic, employed by Green and Polford, Limited, of Clothford, agents for all the leading firms of typewriter manufacturers. "I believe you're a native of Hathelsborough, aren't you, Outhwaite?" began Meeking. "I am, sir." "Keep up your interest in the old place, eh?" "I do, sir." "Have you any relations in the town?" "Yes, sir, several." "Do they send you the Hathelsborough paper, the Monitor, every week?" "Yes, sir, regularly." "Did they send you a copy of the Monitor in which there was a facsimile of the threatening letter addressed to the late Mayor by some anonymous correspondent?" "Yes, sir." "Did you look at the facsimile?" "I did, sir." "Notice anything peculiar or strange or remarkable about it?" "Yes, sir. I noticed that some of the letters were broken and some defective." "You noticed that as an expert mechanic, working at these things?" "It was obvious to anybody, sir. The letters, some of them, were badly broken." "Look at the dock, Outhwaite. Do you know the prisoner, Simon Crood?" "Well enough, sir." "How long have you known him?" "Ever since I was a youngster, sir. Always." "Have you ever seen Simon Crood at Green and Polford's, your employers?" "I have, sir." "When was that?" "He came in 2 days after I had seen the facsimile, sir." "Bring anything with him?" "Yes, sir, that typewriter before you." "Sure it was this particular machine?" "Positive, sir. It's an old Semingford machine, number 32,587. "Did you hear him say anything about it?" "I did, sir. He told our Mr. Jeaveson, manager he is, that this was a machine he'd bought in London many years ago, that the lettering seemed to be getting worn out, and that he wanted to know if we could supply new letters and do the machine up generally." "Yes, what then?" "Mr. Jeaveson said we could, and the machine was handed over to me for repair." "Did you make any discovery about it?" "Yes, sir. That afternoon I just ran the lettering off to see what defects there were. I found then that the broken and defective letters were identical with those in the facsimile letter that I'd seen in the Monitor 2 days before." "Just come down here, Outhwaite. Take this sheet of paper and run the letters off again, so that their worships can compare the broken and defective letters with those in the threatening letter. Now," continued Meeking, when the mechanic had complied with this suggestion and gone back to the witness box, "what did you do on making this discovery?" "I told Mr. Jeaveson about it, sir, and showed him what I meant. He discussed the matter with Mr. Polford afterwards, and it was decided that I should go over to Hathelsborough and see Mr. Hawthwaite, taking the machine with me." "Did you do that?" "Yes, sir, next day in the evening." "Did you tell Superintendent Hawthwaite of your discovery, and hand the machine over to him?" "Yes, sir, both." "Did he have the machine wrapped and sealed up in your presence?" "He did, sir." "This machine, now, on the table?" "That machine, sir." "And this is the machine that the prisoner, Simon Crood, brought himself to Green and Polford's?" "That's the machine, sir." Meeking nodded to his witness, signifying that he had no more to ask, but before Outhwaite could leave the box, Stedman, the local solicitor, with whom Simon Crood had held a whispered conversation on coming into court, rose and began to cross-examine him. "Did you happen to be in Green and Polford's shop the front shop, I mean when Alderman Crood brought in that machine?" he asked. "I was there at the time, sir," replied Outhwaite. "Did he come quite openly?" "Yes, sir, in a cab, as a matter of fact. The cabman carried in the machine." "Did Alderman Crood say who he was?" "Well, sir, to be exact, he saw me as soon as he came in, and recognized me. He said, 'Oh, a Hathelsborough lad, I see. You'll know me, young man.' Then he told Mr. Jeaveson and myself what he wanted." "The whole business was quite open and above board, then?" "Quite so, sir." "He drew your attention himself to the defects of the machine?" "He did, sir." "And this was after, not before, that facsimile appeared in the Monitor?" "After, sir." "Now I want a particularly careful answer, Outhwaite, to my next question. Did Alderman Crood ask you to get these repairs made immediately?" "No, sir, he did not. He said he was in no hurry." "You were to take your own time about them, the machine remaining with you?" "Just that, sir." Stedman sat down, as if satisfied, and Outhwaite left the witness box. At the calling of the next witness's name, Tansley nudged Brent. "Now we may hear something lively," he whispered. "This chap's been the borough accountant for some years, and I've often wondered if he doesn't know a good deal that he's kept to himself. But if he does, will he let it out? Old Crood doesn't look over pleased to see him, anyway." Brent glanced from the new witness, a quiet, reserved-looking man of middle age, to Simon Crood. There was a dark scowl on the heavy features, and Brent fancied a look of apprehension. Once more Simon beckoned to his solicitor and exchanged a few whispered words with him across the front of the dock before turning to the witness. And to him Brent also turned with an instinctive feeling that he possibly held a key to those mysteries which had not yet been produced. "Matthew James Nettleton, member of the Society of Incorporated Accountants and Auditors, Borough Accountant of Hathelsborough during the last 7 years. During that period in close touch with all the persons concerned in the present matter." "Mr. Nettleton," said Meeking, "you are the Borough Accountant of Hathelsborough?" The witness folded his hands on the ledge of the box and shook his head. "No," he answered. "Was." "Was? What do you mean?" "I have resigned my appointment." "When?" "Yesterday, at 6 o'clock last evening, to be precise." "May I ask why?" "You may, sir. Because I knew the inquiry just held by the Inspector of the Local Government Board to be an absolute farce. Because I know that the financial affairs of the borough are rotten ripe. Because I utterly refuse to be a cat's paw in the hands of the Town Trustees any longer. Those are my reasons." Tansley dug his elbow into Brent's ribs as an irrepressible murmur of surprise broke out all round the court. But Brent was watching the men in the dock. Krevin Crood smiled cynically; the smile developed into a short, sharp laugh. But Simon's flabby face turned a dull red, and presently he lifted his big silk handkerchief and wiped his forehead. Meeking waited a moment, letting the witness's outburst have its full effect. Then, amidst a dead silence, he leaned towards the box. "Why didn't you say all that at the recent inquiry?" he asked. "Because it wouldn't have been a scrap of good," retorted the witness. "Those affairs are all cut and dried. My only course was to do what I did last night resign, and to give evidence now." Meeking twisted his gown together and looked at the magistrates. He ran his eye carefully along the row of faces, and finally let it settle again on his witness. "Tell their worships, in your own fashion, your considered opinion as to the state of the borough finances," he said. "Your opinion, based on your experience." "They are, as I said just now, absolutely rotten," declared Nettleton. "It is now 7 years since I came to this place as borough accountant. I found that under an ancient charter The whole of the financial business of the borough was in the hands of a small body known as the Town Trustees, 3 only in number. It is marvellous that such a body should be allowed to exist in these days. The Town Trustees are responsible to nobody. They elect themselves; that is to say, if one dies, the surviving 2 elect his successor. They are not bound to render accounts to anyone. The Corporation, of which they are a permanent committee, only knows what they choose to tell. This has gone on for at least 3 centuries. It may have served some good purpose at some period, under men of strict probity, but in my opinion, based on such experience as I have been able to command, it has of late years led to nothing but secret peculation, jobbery and knavery. As regards my own position, it has simply been that I have never at any time been permitted to see any accounts other than those placed before me by the Town Trustees. My belief is that no one but themselves actually knows what the financial condition of the town really is. I am of the impression that this Corporation, as a corporation, is bankrupt." There now arose a murmur in court which the chairman and officials found it difficult to suppress. But curiosity prevailed over excitement, and the silence was deep enough when Meeking got in his next question. "You affirm all this in face of the recent inquiry?" "I do, and strongly. The accounts shown at the recent inquiry were all carefully manipulated, arranged, cooked by the Town Trustees. I had nothing to do with them. They were prepared by the Town Trustees, chiefly, I imagine, by Mallett and Coppinger, with Crood's approval and consent. They were never shown to me. In short, my position has been this, simply: I have had certain accounts placed before me by the Town Trustees with the curt intimation that my sole duty was to see that the merely arithmetical features were correct and to sign them as accountant." "Could you not have made a statement to this effect at the inquiry?" "I could not." "Why, now?" "Because I could not have produced the books and papers. All the books and papers to which I have ever had access are merely such things as rate books and so on, the sort of things that can't be concealed. But the really important books and papers, showing the real state of things, are in the possession of Mallett and Coppinger, who, with Crood, have never allowed anybody to see them. If I could have had those things brought before the inspector, I could have proved something. But I couldn't bring them before a court of inquiry like that. You can bring them before this." "How?" demanded Meeking. "Because, I take it, they bear a very sinister relation to the murder of the late Mayor," replied the witness. "He was as well aware as I am that things were all wrong." "You know that?" "I know that he did his best, from such material as he could get at, to find out what the true state of things was. He worked hard at examining such accounts as were available. To my knowledge, he did his best to get at the secret accounts kept by the Town Trustees. He failed utterly; they defied him. Yet just before his murder he was getting at facts in a fashion which was not only unpleasant but highly dangerous to them, and they were aware of it." "Can you give us an example of any of these facts, these discoveries?" "Yes, I can give you one in particular. Wallingford was slowly but surely getting at the knowledge of the system of secret payment which has gone on in this place for a long time under the rule of the Town Trustees. He had found out the truth, for instance, as regards Krevin Crood. Krevin Crood was supposed to be paid a pension of £150 a year. In reality he was paid £300 a year. Wallingford ascertained this beyond all doubt, and that it had gone on ever since Krevin Crood's retirement from his official position. There are other men in the borough, hangers-on and supporters of the Town Trustees, who benefit by public money in the shape of pensions, grants, doles. In every case the actual amount paid is much more than the amount set down in such accounts as are shown. Wallingford meant to sweep all this jobbery away." "How?" "By getting the financial affairs of the town into the full and absolute control of the Corporation. He wanted to abolish the Town Trustees as a body. If he had succeeded in his aims, he would have done away with all the abuses which they not only kept up, but encouraged. Then, if Wallingford's reforms had been carried out, Krevin Crood would have lost £150 a year? He would have lost £300 a year. Wallingford's scheme included the utter abolition of all these Town Trustee-created pensions and doles. Lock, stock and barrel, they were all to go. And the Town Trustees, Crood, Mallett, Croppinger, were fully acquainted with his intentions and those of his party? The witness shrugged his shoulders. "That's well known," he answered. "They were frightened of him and his schemes to the last degree. They knew what it meant." What did it mean? Nettleton glanced at Simon Crood and smiled. "Just what it's come to at last," he said. "Exposure and disgrace." "Well," said Meeking, when a murmur of excited feeling had once more run round the court, "a more particular question, Mr. Nettleton. Did the late Mayor ever come to your office in the course of his investigations?" "He did, frequently. Not that I had much to show him. But he carefully examined all the books and papers of which I was in possession." "Did he make notes?" "Notes and memoranda, yes. At considerable length, sometimes." "What in?" "In a thickish memorandum book, with a stout cover of red leather, which he always carried in his pocket." "Could you identify that book if you saw it?" "Certainly. Besides, you would find it full of his notes and figures." "That will do for the present, Mr. Nettleton, unless my friend here wants to examine you. No? Then recall Superintendent Hawthwaite for a moment. Superintendent, you have just heard of a certain pocket book which belonged to the late Mayor. Was it found on his dead body, or on his desk, or anywhere, after the murder? No? Not after the most careful and thorough search? Completely disappeared? Very good. Now let us have Louisa Speck." A smartly dressed, self-possessed young woman came forward, and Tansley, nudging Brent, whispered to him that this was Mallett's parlour maid, and that things were getting deuced interesting. Chapter 22 of The Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Parlour Maid. That the appearance of Louisa Speck in the witness box came as something more than an intense surprise to at any rate two particular persons in the court was evidence at once to Brent's watchful eye. Mrs. Mallett, a close observer of what was going on, started as her parlour maid's name was called, and lifting her eyeglass surveyed the girl with a wondering stare of prolonged inspection. And in the dock Krevin Crood also let a start of astonishment escape him. He, too, stared at Louisa Speck, and a frown showed itself between his eyebrows, as if he were endeavouring to explain her presence to himself. Suddenly it cleared, and he indulged his fancies with a sharp laugh, and turning to Simon made some whispered observation. Simon nodded sullenly, as if he comprehended. From that point forward he kept his small eyes firmly fixed on the witness. Tansley, too, noticed these things, and bent towards his companion with a meaning glance. "This young woman knows something," he muttered, "and those two chaps in the dock know what it is." The young woman upon whom all eyes were fixed was perhaps the most self-possessed person present. She answered the preliminary questions as coolly as if she had been giving evidence in murder cases as a regular thing. Louisa Speck, 26 years of age. Been in the employ of Mrs. Mallett of the Bank House for 3 years. Still in that employment as far as she knew. What did she mean by that? Well, that Mrs. Mallett had left the house some days before, and that since yesterday afternoon Mr. Mallett had not been there, and accordingly neither she nor the other servants knew exactly where things stood. "Just so," observed Meeking. "Somewhat uncertain, eh? Very well." He paused a moment, glanced at his papers, and suddenly leaned forward towards the witness box with a sharp, direct look at its occupant. "Now then," he said, "when did you first hear of the murder of the late Mayor, Mr. Wallingford. Louisa Speck's answer came promptly. The night it happened. What time, and who told you of it? About 9 o'clock. Robertshaw, the policeman, told me. I was at the front door, looking out on the market square, and he was going past. I see. So you remember that evening very well? Quite well. Do you remember the previous evening equally well? Yes. Were you at the Bank House that evening, the evening before the murder? I was. What was going on there that evening? Anything that makes you particularly remember it? Yes. What now? Well, Mrs. Mallett went away that day to visit her sister, Mrs. Coppinger, for a day or two. About noon Mr. Mallett told me and cook that he wanted to have some gentlemen for dinner that evening, and we were to prepare accordingly. I see. Sort of special dinner, eh? Yes. Did the gentlemen come? Yes. Who were they? Mr. Coppinger and Alderman Crood. What time was that? Between 6 and 1/2. What happened after their arrival? They went into the morning room with Mr. Mallett. I took some brown sherry in there, and glasses. Soon after that Mr. Mallett went out. I was just inside the dining room as he crossed over the hall. He told me there'd very likely be another gentleman to dinner, and I must lay another cover. He went out, and was away about 10 minutes. Then he came back with Mr. Krevin Crood. Came back with Mr. Krevin Crood. Did you see them come in together? I let them in. Did you hear anything said as they entered? Yes, I heard Mr. Krevin Crood say that he wasn't dressed for dinner parties. Mr. Mallett then told me to take Mr. Krevin upstairs and get him anything he wanted. Did you take Mr. Krevin upstairs? Yes, I took him up to Mr. Mallett's dressing room. I showed him the hot water arrangement, got him clean towels, and asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted a clean shirt, a collar, and a handkerchief. A handkerchief? Yes, a handkerchief. Did you get him these things? I showed him where to get them. I opened the drawers in which Mr. Mallett's shirts, collars, and handkerchiefs are kept, so that he could help himself. Then I asked him if there was anything else more I could get him. He said there was nothing but a clothes brush. I got him that and left him. When did you see him next? About 20 minutes after, when he came downstairs and went into the morning room to the other gentlemen. Was he smartened up then? He was smart enough, smarter than the others, I should say. Had he taken one of Mr. Mallett's shirts? Yes, one of his very best white ones. Very good. Now then, talking about shirts, who looks after the laundry affairs at the Bank House? I do. You send the linen to the laundry? Yes. And receive it and put it away when it comes back? Yes. Always? Always. When does it go, and when does it return? It goes on Monday morning and comes home on Saturday afternoon. Do you put it away on Saturday afternoon? Not finely. It goes into a hot cupboard to air. Then, on Monday sometime, I put it away in the proper place, sort it out. I see. Do you remember sorting it out and putting away the different articles in their proper places on the Monday before this little dinner party? Yes, I do. Did you notice the presence of any article which didn't belong to the Mallett family? Yes, at least I was doubtful. Doubtful, eh? Well, what was it? A gentleman's handkerchief. You weren't sure that it was Mr. Mallett's? I wasn't sure that it wasn't, and I didn't think it was. Why were you uncertain? Well, this wasn't like Mr. Mallett's handkerchiefs. He had dozens of them, nearly all fancy ones, with coloured borders. This was a very fine cambric handkerchief. I'd never seen one like it before, but still I wasn't certain that it wasn't Mr. Mallett's after all. Why? Because sometimes, when Mr. Mallett was away for the day, he'd buy a spare handkerchief. He's a lot of odd handkerchiefs that he's brought home in his pockets. I thought that this might have been got that way. You didn't mention its presence to anybody? No, I didn't think of it. Well, what did you do with the handkerchief about which you were doubtful? I laid it on top of one of several piles of handkerchiefs that were in Mr. Mallett's handkerchief drawer in the dressing room." "Why did you put it on top?" "In case any inquiry was made about it from Mariner's Laundry." "Was any inquiry made?" "No." "Now, was that drawer you have just spoken of the drawer that you pulled open for Mr. Krevin Crood?" "Yes." "Was the handkerchief there then?" "Yes, it was there." "You saw it?" "I saw it." "Have you ever seen it since?" "Never." "Do you know if Mr. Krevin Crood took it out of the drawer?" "No." "Did you see it in his possession that evening?" "No, I didn't, but it wasn't in the drawer next morning." "You are sure of that?" "Positive. I went into Mr. Mallett's dressing room very early next morning, and I noticed that Mr. Krevin had left the drawers half open. The handkerchief drawer stuck a little, and I pulled it right out before pushing it in. I noticed then that the handkerchief had gone." "Did you conclude that Mr. Krevin had taken it?" "No, I don't think so. I didn't conclude anything. If I thought anything, it would be that Mr. Mallett had taken it. Mr. Mallett would think nothing of taking half a dozen handkerchiefs a day." "But the handkerchief was there when you opened the drawer for Mr. Krevin that evening, and it wasn't there when you looked into the drawer next morning early. That so?" "Yes, that's so." "Very well. Now then, about this little dinner. Mr. Mallett had three guests, Mr. Simon Crood, Mr. Krevin Crood, Mr. Coppinger? Nobody else?" "No, no one else." "Was it a nice dinner?" "It was a very good dinner." "Wine?" "There were several sorts of wine." "What time was dinner?" "About 7:15." "And what time did the gentlemen rise from the table?" "They didn't rise from the table. When dinner was over, Mr. Mallett decanted some very special port that he has in the wine cellar, and they settled down to it round the dinner table talking." "I see. Did you hear any of the conversation?" "No, I didn't. I carried 2 decanters of the port into the dining room for Mr. Mallett, and got out port glasses from the sideboard, and after that I never went into the room again." "Until what hour did Mr. Mallett's guests remain with him?" "Well, Alderman Crood and Mr. Krevin Crood left at about 11:15. They went away together. Mr. Coppinger stopped till about 11:30. Meeking paused at this point, put his hand underneath the papers which lay in front of him, and produced a cardboard box. From this, after slowly undoing various wrappings, he took the fragment of stained and charred handkerchief which had been found in the Mayor's Parlour, and passed it across to the witness. "Take that in your hand and look at it carefully," he said. "Now, do you recognise that as part of the handkerchief to which I have been referring?" "It's the same sort of stuff," replied Louisa. "I should say it was part of that handkerchief. It's just like it." "Same material? An unusual material?" "I think it is the same handkerchief. It's an unusually broad hem. I noticed that at the time." "To the best of your belief, is that the handkerchief you've been talking about?" "Yes," declared Louisa Speck, this time without hesitation. "It is." Meeking sat down and glanced at Simon Crood's solicitor. Stedman accepted the challenge, and rising, threw some scornful meanings into his first question to the witness. "Who got you to tell all this tale?" he asked satirically. "Who got at you?" Louisa Speck bridled. "Nobody got at me," she retorted. "What do you mean by such a question?" "You don't mean to tell their Worships that you haven't been induced to come forward and tell all this?" suggested Stedman incredulously. "Come, now! Who helped you to refresh your memory and to put all this together?" "Nobody helped me," replied Louisa Speck with rising indignation. "Do you think I'm not capable of doing things on my own? I can use my eyes and ears as well as you can, and perhaps better." "Answer my question," said Stedman, as a laugh rose against him. "Who got you to go to the police?" "Nobody got me to go to the police. I went to the police on my own account. I read the newspaper about what took place at the inquest, The last inquest, I mean, and as soon as I heard about the handkerchief I knew very well that that was the one I'd noticed in our laundry, and so I went to see Mr. Hawthwaite. Mr. Hawthwaite's known what I had to tell you for a good while now." Stedman was taken aback. But he put a definite question. "On your oath, did you see that handkerchief in Mr. Krevin Crood's possession that night he was at Mr. Mallett's?" he asked. "I've already told him I never did," retorted Louisa Speck, pointing at Meeking. "I didn't see him with it, but I'm very certain he got it." Stedman waved the witness away, and Meeking proceeded to put in the depositions taken before the Coroner in regard to the finding of the fragment of handkerchief and its ownership, and called evidence to show that the piece just produced was that which had been picked up from the hearth in the Mayor's Parlour on the evening of the murder, soon after the finding of the dead man, and to prove that it had remained in the custody of the police ever since. The fragment went the round of the bench of magistrates, and Tansley whispered to Brent that if Meeking could prove that Krevin Crood had taken that handkerchief out of Mallett's drawer and had thrown it away on the following evening in the Mayor's Parlour, Krevin's neck was in danger. "But there's a link missing yet," he murmured. "How did Krevin get at Wallingford? They've got to prove that. However, Meeking's evidently well primed and knows what he's after. What's coming next?" What came next was the glancing of the barrister's eye towards a venerable, grey-bearded man who sat in the front row of spectators, leaning on a gold-headed cane. He rose as Meeking looked at him, and came slowly forward, a curious figure in those sombre surroundings. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of In the Mayor's Parlour by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Connecting Wall. From a certain amount of whispering and nodding that went on around him, Brent gathered that this ancient gentleman was not unknown to many of those present. But Tansley was turning to him, ready as always with information. "That's old Dr. Pellery," he whispered. "Old Dr. Septimus Pellery. Tremendous big pot on antiquarianism, archaeology, and that sort of stuff. Used to live here in Hathelsborough years ago, when I was a youngster. I should have thought he was dead long since. Wonder where they unearthed him, and what he's here for. No end of a swell, in his own line, anyway." Meeking seemed determined to impress on the court the character and extent of Dr. Pellery's qualifications as an expert in archaeological matters. Addressing him in an almost reverential manner, he proceeded to enumerate the witness's distinctions. "Dr. Pellery, you are, I believe, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries?" "I have that honour." "And a member of more than one archaeological society?" "I am." "And a corresponding member of various foreign societies of a similar sort?" "For many years." "You are also, I think, a Doctor of Civil Law of the University of Oxford?" "Yes." "And the author of many books and articles on your pet subject, archaeology?" "That is so." "Am I right, Dr. Pellery, in believing that you are thoroughly well acquainted with the archaeology, antiquities, and ancient architecture of this town?" "Quite right. I lived here for several years 10 or 11 years." "That was when?" "It is about 20 years since I left this place." "You made a close study of it while you were resident here?" "A very close study. Hathelsborough, from my point of view, is one of the most deeply interesting towns in England. While I lived here I accumulated a vast mass of material respecting its history and antiquities, with the idea of writing a monograph on the borough. But I have never made use of it." "Let us hope that you will still do so, Dr. Pellery," said Meeking, with a suave smile and polite bow. But Dr. Pellery shook his head and stroked his long beard. A cynical smile played round his wrinkled eyes. "No, I don't think I ever shall," he said. "Indeed, I'm sure I shan't." "May I ask why?" "You may. because there aren't 20 people in Hathelsborough who would buy such a book. Hathelsborough people don't care tuppence about the history of their old town. All they care about is money. This case is a proof." "I think we'll get back to the case," said Meeking, amidst a ripple of laughter. "Well, we may consider you as the greatest living expert on Hathelsborough anyway, Dr. Pellery, and eminently fitted to give us some very important evidence. Do you know the ancient church of St. Lawrence at the back of this Moot Hall?" "Aye, as well as I know my own face in the glass," answered Dr. Pellery with a short laugh. "Every stone of it." "It is, I believe, a very old church?" "It is the oldest church not only in Hathelsborough, which is saying a good deal, but in all this part of the country," replied the witness with emphasis. "St. Hathelswide, the parish church, is old, but St. Lawrence antedates it by at least 500 years. The greater part of St. Lawrence, as it now stands, was complete in the 8th century. St. Hathelswide was built in the 13th. Meeking produced a large chart, evidently made for the occasion, and had it set up on the table, in full view of the bench and the witness box. "From this plan, Dr. Pellery, it appears that the west tower, a square tower, of St. Lawrence immediately faces the back of the Moot Hall, and between the outer hall of the tower and the outer wall of the Moot Hall there is a sort of connecting wall." "Not a sort of," interrupted Dr. Pellery. "It is a connecting wall, 36 feet long, 10 feet high, and 8 feet in width, forming an arch over the street beneath, the narrow street called St. Lawrence Lane." "It is an uncommon feature, that wall?" suggested Meeking. "Comparatively, yes. I know of other places where ancient buildings are so joined, but there are few examples." "Well, I want to ask you a very important question about that connecting wall. Is there a secret way through that wall from St. Lawrence Tower to the Moot Hall?" Dr. Pellery drew himself up, stroked his beard, and glanced round the court. Then he gave Meeking an emphatic nod. "There is, and I discovered it, years ago, and I have always thought that I was the only living person who knew of it." Meeking let this answer soak into the mentality of his hearers. Then he said quietly, "Will you tell us all about it, Dr. Pellery?" "Enough for your purpose," replied the witness. "You have there, I believe, a sectional drawing of the tower. Give it to me. Now," he continued, holding up a sheet of stout paper and illustrating his remarks with the tip of his forefinger, "I will show you what I mean. St. Lawrence Tower is 80 feet in height. It is divided into 3 sections. The lower section, the most considerable of the 3, forms a western porch to the church itself, which is entered from it by a Norman arch. Above this is the middle section, above that the upper section, wherein are 3 ancient bells. The middle and upper sections are reached from the lower by a newel stair set in the southwest angle of the tower. Now, the middle section has for many centuries been a beamed and panelled chamber from which the bells are rung, and wherein are stored a good many old things belonging to the church, chiefly in ancient chests. During the years that I lived in Hathelsborough, I spent a great deal of time in this chamber. The then Vicar of St. Lawrence, Mr. Goodbody, allowed me to examine anything I found stored there. It was amongst the muniments and registers of St. Lawrence, indeed, that I discovered a great deal of valuable information about the history of the town. Well, I have just said that this chamber, this middle section of the tower, is panelled. It is panelled from the oak flooring to within 2 feet of the oak beams in its ceiling, and the panelling, though it is probably 400 years old, is in an excellent state of preservation. Now, about the middle of the last year that I spent in this town, I began to be very puzzled about the connecting wall between St. Lawrence Tower and the Moot Hall. I saw no reason for making an arch at that point, and the wall had certainly not been built as a support, for the masonry of the tower and of the hall is unusually solid. I got the idea that that wall had been originally built as a means of communication between tower and hall, that it was hollow, and that there at each extremity there was a secret means of entrance and exit. I knew from experience that this sort of thing was common in Hathelsborough. The older part of the town is a veritable rabbit warren. There is scarcely a house in the market-place, for instance, in which there is not a double staircase, the inner one being very cleverly concealed, and I know of several secret ways and passages, entered, say, on one side of a street and terminating far off on another. There is a secret underground way between the market square, which is entered at the Barbican in the castle, and terminates in St. Faith's Chapel in St. Hathelswide's Church. There is another, also underground, from St. Matthias's Hospital to the God's House in Cripple Lane. There are others. As I say, the old town is honeycombed. So there would be, of course, nothing unusual or remarkable in the presence of a secret passage between St. Lawrence Tower and the Moot Hall. The only thing was that there was no record of any such passage through the connecting wall. No one had ever heard of it, and there were no signs of entrance to it either in the tower or in the Moot Hall. However, I discovered it by careful and patient investigation of the panelling in the chamber I have mentioned. The panelling is divided on each side of the chamber into 7 compartments. The 4th compartment on the outer wall slides back and gives access to a passage cut through the arch across St. Lawrence Lane and so to the Moot Hall. "There's one man here who knows all this," whispered Tansley in Brent's ear. "Look at Krevin Crood." Krevin was smiling. There was something unusually cynical in his smile, but it conveyed more than cynical amusement to Brent. There was in it the suggestion of assurance. Krevin, decided Brent, had something up his sleeve. But the other people present were still intent on the old antiquary. Having come to the end of his explanation, he was passing back the chart to Meeking, and seemed satisfied with what he had said. Meeking, however, wanted more. "To the Moot Hall," he repeated. "Well, Dr. Pellery, and where does this passage emerge in the Moot Hall?" "Just so," said Dr. Pellery. "That, of course, is important. Well, the wall or arch between St. Lawrence Tower and the Moot Hall, on reaching the outer wall of the latter, is continued within, from that outer wall along the right-hand side of the corridor off which the extremely ancient chamber known as the Mayor's Parlour is situated. If close examination is made of that wall, you will find that it is 8 feet thick. But it is not a solid wall. The secret passage I have mentioned runs through it, to a point halfway along the length of the Mayor's Parlour, and access to the Mayor's Parlour is had by a secret door in the old panelling of that chamber, just as in the case of the chamber in the church tower." "You investigated all this yourself, Dr. Pellery?" "Discovered and investigated it." "And kept the secret to yourself?" "I did. I saw no reason for communicating it to anyone." "However, as you discovered it, it was not impossible that others should make the same discovery?" "It is very evident that somebody has discovered it," replied the witness with emphasis. "Now, you say that it is about 20 years since you made this discovery. Have you been in St. Lawrence Tower since?" "Yes, Superintendent Hawthwaite has been in communication with me, privately, about this matter for some time. I came to Hathelsborough yesterday, and in the afternoon he and I visited the tower, and I showed him the secret way and the doors in the panelling. We passed from the tower into the Mayor's Parlour, as you or anyone may just now, if you know the secret of the sliding panels." "Is it what you would call a difficult secret?" "Not a bit of it, once you have hit on the exact spot at which to exert a pressure. The panels are then moved back quite easily." "Your evidence, then, Dr. Pellery, comes to this. There is a secret passage through the apparently solid arch in St. Lawrence Lane, which leads directly from the middle chamber in St. Lawrence Tower to the Mayor's Parlour in the Moot Hall. Is that correct?" Dr. Pellery made an old-fashioned bow. "That is absolutely correct." "I am sure the court is greatly obliged to you, sir," said Meeking, responding to the old man's courtesy. He looked round, and seeing that Stedman made no sign, glanced at the policeman who stood by the witness box. "Call Stephen Spizey," he commanded. Spizey moved ponderously into the box in all the glory of his time-honoured livery. He looked very big and very consequential and unusually glum. Meeking, who was not a Hathelsborough man, glanced quizzingly at Spizey's grandeur and at the cocked hat which Spizey placed on the ledge before him. You're some sort of a Corporation official, aren't you, Spizey?" he suggested. "Apparitor to His Worshipful the Mayor of Hathelsborough," responded Spizey in his richest tones. "Mace-bearer to his Worship, town-crier, bellman, steward of the pound, steward of High Cross and Low Cross, summoner of Thursday market, convener of Saturday market, receiver of dues and customs—" "You appear to be a good deal of a pluralist," interrupted Meeking. "However, are you caretaker of St. Lawrence Church?" "I am." "Do you live in a cottage at the corner of St. Lawrence churchyard?" "I do." "Do you remember the evening on which Mr. Wallingford was murdered?" "Yes." "At 7 o'clock of that evening were you in your cottage?" "I was." "Did Mr. Krevin Crood come to your cottage door about 7 o'clock and ask you for the keys of St. Lawrence?" "He did." "Did he say why he wanted to go into the church?" "Yes, to write out a hinscription for a London gent as wanted it." "Did you give him the keys?" "I did." "Did you see him go into the church?" "Yes, and hear him lock himself inside it." "Did he eventually bring the keys back?" "Not to me. My missus." Meeking waved Spizey's magnificence aside and called for Mrs. Spizey. Mrs. Spizey, too, readily remembered the evening under discussion, and said so, with a sniff which seemed to indicate decided disapproval of her memories respecting it. "What were you doing that evening, Mrs. Spizey?" asked Meeking. "Which for the most part of it, sir, I was a washing of that very floor as you're a standing on, sir, me being cleaner to the Moot Hall. That'd be from 6 to 8." "Then you went home, I suppose?" "I did, sir, and very thankful, too." "Was your husband at home?" "He were not, sir. Which Spizey had gone out to have his glass, sir, as is his custom." "Did Mr. Krevin Crood come to you with the keys of the church?" "He did, sir. Which the clock had just struck 8. And remarked, sir, that the light was failing, and that his eyes wasn't as strong as they had been. Pleasant like, sir." "I see. Had Mr. Krevin Crood any papers in his hand?" "He had papers in his hand, sir, or under his arm." "And that was just after 8 o'clock?" "The clocks had just struck it, sir." Meeking nodded his dismissal of Mrs. Spizey. It was plain that he was getting near the end of his case, and his manner became sharp and almost abrupt. "Call Detective Sergeant Welton," he said. "Welton, were you present when Superintendent Hawthwaite arrested the prisoner Krevin Crood, and afterwards when the other prisoner, Simon Crood, was taken into custody?" "I was, sir." "Did you afterwards, on Superintendent Hawthwaite's instructions, search Krevin Crood's lodgings and Simon Crood's house?" "I did, sir." "Tell their Worships what you found." "I first made a search at the rooms occupied by Krevin Crood in Little Bailey Gate. I there found in an old writing case kept in his bedroom a quantity of papers and documents in the handwriting of the late Mayor, Mr. Wallingford. I handed these over to Superintendent Hawthwaite. I now produce them. There are 56 separate papers in all. I have gone through them carefully. All relate to Corporation accounts and to the financial affairs of the borough. Several are blood-stained." There was a shiver of horror among the women present as the witness handed over a sheaf of various sized papers, indicating where the stains lay. But the even-toned, matter-of-fact, coldly official voice went on. "Later I made a search of the prisoner Simon Crood's house at the tannery. In a desk in a room which he used as a private office I found more papers and documents similar to those which I had found at Krevin Crood's lodgings. I produced these. There are 17 separate papers. All are in the handwriting of the late Mr. Wallingford. I also discovered in a drawer of Simon Crood's bedroom a memorandum book, bound in red leather, the greater part of which is filled with notes and figures made by the late Mayor. I produced this too. I also identify it as a book which the late Mayor was in the habit of carrying about with him. I have frequently seen him make use of it." While every neck was craned forward to catch a glimpse of the memorandum book, Tansley suddenly saw Krevin Crood making signals to him from the dock. He drew Brent's attention to the fact, then went down into the well of the court and over to Krevin. Brent watched them curiously. It seemed to him that Krevin was asking Tansley's advice, and that Tansley was dissuading Krevin from adopting some particular course. They conversed for some minutes, while the magistrates were examining the memorandum book and the papers. Simon Crood joined in and seemed to agree with Tansley. But suddenly Krevin turned away from both with a decisive gesture and advanced to the front of the dock. "Your Worships," he exclaimed in a loud, compelling tone, "I have had quite enough of this farce. I desire to make a full and important statement." Chapter 24